The Town That Time Forgot by Elizabeth Donley-Leer. Narrated by Eric Fox. Preface. Although I understand different regions of the world experience things differently within the same era, the people and settings in this book are representative of the way things were when I spent my teen years growing up in Southern California in the 1980s. As such, the characters have been developed using my first-hand experience of living in the era in California as a 20-something. My experiences on the East Coast of the United States happened much later in life, so the basic setting and character development in this book is a compilation of my life's experiences and may not be exactly the way you remember people and places in the 1980s. I hope you enjoy this fictional story, inspired by many of my life's real-world events. 1. The Making of Mr. Blanchard. As he sat in the back of the church, being shunned by his supposed Christian peers, listening to the minister pontificate his own beliefs as law, Blake remembered his own childhood growing up as an orphan within these very walls. He remembered the way some of these very parishioners would tease and bully him because of his unusual appearance, as if it were his fault. He had gray hair by the time he was 15, or that he could eat whatever he wanted and remain rail thin. They would taunt him about the paleness of his skin until he could take it no longer and would become violent in the name of self-preservation. And then, somehow the adults would make him out to be the bad guy. He did not remember his parents or how he had come to live in this place almost 2 decades ago. The only memories he had were of the horrible childhood he had here, and being force-fed the Christian philosophy the hypocrites bullying him wanted him to live by. But today would be different. Today he turned 18, or at least that is what he was being told. He would finally become free of this place, whether by choice or by force according to orphanage guidelines. This place he had thought of as home from before he could speak would no longer have a hold over him. As miserable as his time spent at this religious institute of compassion and charitable giving was, his life could have been much worse. He could have ended up in one of the many workhouses or forced apprenticeships by the time he was 5 or 6, like many of the other residents were made to do. It was only by happenstance that the same odd and off-putting appearance that made him the laughingstock of bullies also kept him from being sent to any of the work institutions where those in charge of running these workplaces would take one look at him, thinking he was sickly or would cause havoc within their work environment, and reject him. This did not mean he didn't have to work for his keep, though. His caretakers saw to that. They made him work even harder, doing chores that were normally performed by adults at the orphanage grounds, to make up for his inability to earn wages for the institution. He didn't remember his arrival at this place of torment, but he had been told he was abandoned on their front doorstep, wrapped only in a shroud of black fabric inside a wooden crate. A label in a foreign language with a name burned into the outside of the crate were the only indications of where he had come from. Those who found him decided to call him what they thought was written on the side of the crate, and that's how he became Blake Blanchard. Beyond that, he knew nothing about who he was, except who he had been forcibly taught to be by his keepers. As of today, he would be released to the outside world to fend for himself and learn the ways of those men who lived beyond the confined protection of the orphanage grounds. Now that he was forever free of this place which he had dreamt of leaving for so long, Blake wasn't sure where he would go. All he knew was that he wanted to be as far as humanly possible from the place and the horrible people who ran the facility and dwelled within its walls. With his few meager possessions flung over his shoulder, Blake never looked back as he walked down the only road that led into the town that had taught him all he ever knew. The people who had bullied and taunted him relentlessly, implanting a feeling of worthlessness into his self-perception, would no longer reign over his existence. It was his turn to decide who he was and would be. His only focus going forward would be on the future and finding a place where he belonged. Little did he know he would soon come to a crossroad that would forever change his life and the way he perceived himself and those around him. Blake wandered from town to town looking for work and a place to call home. But every town was the same. Ridicule, doors slamming in his face, and people wanting nothing to do with the odd-looking stranger who dared to approach them. It was as if he had never left the orphanage at all, or the tiny town that encompassed it. He tried to convince himself that the poverty and oppression of the time made people more fearful and skeptical. The more times he experienced the same reactions, the more he began to believe his fellow man was the problem, and not the many wars, empirical rule, blight, and famine that spread throughout Europe during the 19th century. After all, wasn't it mankind who was the cause of all the prevalent issues facing humanity in the first place? It had been 6 months of wandering since Blake left the orphanage. As thin as he was before, his bones now protruded, giving him the appearance of a walking skeleton. Meals were few and far between, typically consisting of what limited items he could either steal from those who curtly sent him on his way, or that he was able to catch in the wild using his minimal hunting and foraging skills. He now found himself cold, hungry, and lost, sitting at the water's edge near a rarely used footbridge, wondering if life was worth the struggle. He stared at his reflection in the nearly frozen water, saying to himself how easy it would be to end his misery by simply slipping into the cold water that slowly flowed in front of him. The chill of the water would only hurt for a moment, and then all the pain and discomfort that he dealt with on a daily basis would be gone. The urge became stronger as he felt his body slowly slipping down the embankment, and the water permeating his shoes, soaking his already frozen toes. The water gradually rose up his legs, sending a temporary burning sensation throughout his limbs as his torso fell into the shallow water. By the time his head sank into the water, there was no feeling left within his frail body. He lay there with his eyes closed, wondering when consciousness would cease, when suddenly he heard a voice beckoning to him.
"Blake, what are you doing?"
the voice bellowed. Unconsciously, Blake heard himself responding to the disembodied voice, while he waited for darkness to take him. "I am ending my suffering."
"But why would you want to do such a thing when you have such a glorious future ahead of you?"
The voice's response caught Blake off guard. He had only known loss, misery, and hatred. How could his future be expected to be glorious, he thought to himself. "You must be thinking of someone else," he replied to the voice.
"No, my son."
"Your son? I have no father, nor do I have a mother. I have no one on this earth to call family."
"True. Your mother died in childbirth, unable to bear the gift I had given her. So, no, you do not have anyone on that place you call Earth to call family. But you still have family. You are my son. You are the glorious gift of my unholy union with your mother."
Blake's mind swirled with confusion, thinking to himself, "There's no one here. These must just be my last coherent thoughts as life leaves my body." As if he could read Blake's mind, the voice replied,
"No, Blake, I am real.